It is April 1865. After 4 years of constant fighting and bloodshed, Richmond had finally fallen, now in the hands of federal troops. A photography team, led by John Reiki, made their way out of the city into neighboring Hanover County. They are here to take stereographic photos of two battlefields, Cold Harbor and Gaines' Mill. The images they take end up being some of the most haunting and disturbing images of the war. In front of Gaines's Mill, a skull can be seen lying in the foreground, in front of the burned-out remains of the mill. In the nearby woods, the skeletal remains of dozens, if not hundreds, of men litter the ground. Even in the fields, having gone untended for years, lie the remains of Union and Confederate dead. Some had only been there for a year, but many others had been lying on the ground for nearly 3 years. This gruesome, morbid sight was the all-too-harsh reality of the war, the tragic toll of the war laid out for all to see. And yet, as Riki's team encountered this horrific sight, they found that the work was already underway to finally deal with the countless, unidentified dead still littering the ground. They eventually found a burial team, one composed of black men working on the gruesome yet necessary work of burying the dead. On a stretcher sat a pile of human bones with 5 skulls set atop it, awaiting their internment so long overdue. Riki's team take 2 stereographic photos of this pile of human bones before they eventually depart, bringing with them photos that would become some of the most iconic, disturbing imagery of the entire war. Yet, the gruesome task of repatriating the dead had not stopped there and then. For Cold Harbor National Cemetery, the gruesome task would not truly be completed and likely never will be. In the spring and summer of 1865, as the war finally drew to a long-awaited close, the nation had to confront many challenges. One was the repatriation of the countless thousands of Union and Confederate dead strewn across the countryside, especially in Virginia. Many were buried wherever space could be found, whether that be in family or church graveyards, or right in the front yards of homes that had been hastily converted into field hospitals. In response to the paramount need to recover these remains, and to honor and dignify the Union troops who fought in the war, the federal government created the National Cemetery System in September 1866, which would oversee the repatriation of the thousands of Union dead buried throughout the land. However, for the fields around Cold Harbor and Gaines' Mill, a far more daunting task was at hand because, unlike many other battlefields, many of the dead in the area had never been buried to begin with. There were hundreds upon hundreds of skeletal remains lying across the fields, in the woods, and down in the hollows in a several-mile radius from the newly established cemetery. Many of these dead could not be identified as they had decomposed down to bleached bones with little, if anything, of their clothing remaining. In the end, the only solution to the issue was mass burials. During the repatriation process, it wasn't uncommon for unidentified remains to be buried in mass burials, this being a grave holding more than one person's remains. Most of the national cemeteries from this time period have these small mass burial plots. Most would contain between 2 or 3 men within them, all of whom were likely to be nothing more than skeletal remains at this point, and would usually be marked either with a headstone identifying the number of unknown dead or a plot marker designating the number of burials in that section. However, Cold Harbor National Cemetery faced a far more prolific problem, as the number of skeletal remains was overwhelming. When the first body recovery operation was conducted, it was decided to dig a burial trench in order to inter the hundreds of skeletal remains discovered throughout the area. This resulted in the internment of 568 individuals into the first burial trench, while the others were buried in other sections of the cemetery. In 1867, a second body recovery operation was conducted, which required a second burial trench that would eventually contain the remains of 321 individuals. In total, 889 individuals were buried in two burial trenches spanning nearly the entire length of the cemetery, while those not buried in the burial trenches would take up the overwhelming majority of the cemetery's space. Yet, the lingering concern that bodies were still not collected remained a pressing issue, even after the two recovery operations. In 1870, a book would be published entitled Magnolia Journey, a Union Veteran Revisits the Former Confederate States, which was a collection of letters written by former Union Colonel Russell H. Conwell during his visit through the South. In one letter, he states that the remains of Union dead were still being discovered, intentionally or otherwise, throughout the area around Richmond, including the area around Cold Harbor National Cemetery. The impoverished local population had been scouring the former battlefields for minette balls to sell on the scrap market, or collecting horse bones to sell to glue manufacturers, which led to them stumbling upon these remains. According to Conwell, he'd brought up the issue to the current superintendent of Cold Harbor National Cemetery, Sergeant Major Augustus Berry, a recipient of the Medal of Honor. However, either due to a lack of resources or an illness that would claim Berry's life on August 3rd, 1871, no other searches were conducted. It is likely that, even to this day, the remains of dozens of Union dead still lie in the woods in and around Cold Harbor National Cemetery, though the job of recovering all of the dead was never completed, and likely will never be completed. Their memories will not be forgotten. Even the men buried in the burial trenches have not been forgotten as, in 1877, a marble marker dedicated to those 889 unknown men was erected in their honor, forever marking their final place of rest. In the end, places like Cold Harbor National Cemetery remind us that the aftermath of these terrible conflicts outlast it. As Robert E. Lee once said, "It is good that war is so terrible, lest we grow too fond of it."